Welcome to Chapter 16. We're going to go ahead and talk about childhood psychological disorders in this chapter. And one of the things to kind of note is that we have talked a lot about disorders in childhood throughout this semester when we've been discussing things like anxiety, depression. These occur with children just as well as they do with adults. But this chapter is going to focus on some of the unique aspects and things that we have to consider when diagnosing children and adolescents with particular disorders. So that's what we're going to go ahead and focus on. Taking kind of a broad view of this particular topic, what we're going to first discuss is developmental psychopathology. What does that really mean? And then focus on one of the two main areas of developmental psychopathology, and that is externalizing disorders. So that's what we're going to focus on in this module. So, the overview of the developmental psychopathology is really just an understanding of abnormal behavior within the context of normal development. So it is so important to recognize the issue of developmental norms. And what I mean by that is what is typical of a child at a particular age. So if I gave you a description of someone who had gotten up on a table and started dancing around on it and throwing a fit, you would say, well, that sounds kind of out of the ordinary. That's pretty abnormal. But if I said it was a 2-year-old, then all of a sudden you would readjust your way of thinking about the situation, and you would say, okay, maybe that isn't desirable, but it certainly isn't abnormal. And so developmental psychopathologists really have to have a good understanding of what normal behavior is before they can get into abnormal behavior. Now, the DSM-5 has been criticized over the years for not really differentiating childhood disorders with adult disorders. And so in the DSM-5, which is the most recent of the classifications or editions of the DSM-5, they went ahead and put more of the childhood disorders towards the front of the DSM-5, things like intellectual disabilities, which we talked about in last chapter, but going on in more detail with things like ADHD, learning disabilities, and such. Those usually do show up in more childhood. Now, as I was discussing, there are two major dimensions of psychological problems that we look in children, and you could actually divide adults into this area a little bit. They don't divide quite as neatly because you have the whole issues of personality disorders, and sexual disorders that we've talked about in previous chapters. We really don't see a very high prevalence of either in childhood or even adolescence. And so a good way of thinking about childhood disorders is externalizing and internalizing. Externalizing you can think of as directed outward towards other people, so they create difficulties in the child's external world, whereas psychological problems that primarily affect child's interior or internal directed are called internalizing disorders, things like anxiety and depression. And we'll be getting into those in later modules. But right now, we're going to go ahead and launch into externalizing disorders. So these are ones that are directed outward. And there are a lot of different characteristics that make up a lot of the disorders in the externalizing kind of classification. And they're going to have some similar type of symptoms. Not all of them are going to have the exact same symptoms, but they're going to have these kind of commonalities among them. The first is rule violations. So there's a lot more concerns when the rule violations are frequent, intense, lasting, and pervasive. So children of different ages are likely to violate very different types of rules. So the younger the child, usually the less egregious the violation. But as they get older, obviously these get to be more significant. Those with externalizing problems are going to violate rules at a much younger age than you would developmentally see typically. Now, there is two different patterns to these kind of rule violations, what we call adolescent limited or life course persistent. So life course persistent are going to see rule violations and other behavioral issues earlier in life. These are going to be children oftentimes that are identified, and then they're called life course persistent because a lot of these misbehaviors and rule violations and such will continue throughout the lifespan. Whereas adolescent limited, usually their childhood is unremarkable. You don't see a whole lot of behavior issues, and then they start right after puberty, and they tend to occur for most of adolescence, maybe into emerging adulthood, but then stop and go back to not having any issues. So obviously, we're more concerned about the life course persistent, though you can still get into a lot of trouble and have difficulties with adolescent limited. Now, there are some other symptoms that we see commonly among externalizing disorders. That is anger and aggression. Younger children may lose their temper, be more argumentative, while adolescents may look like they're more hostile and have a likelihood of physically injuring others. So you can see kind of a difference there in the upper area. You can see a child sticking her tongue out and having kind of a rule violation there, whereas we have a couple adolescents down below where there's a more anger and physical aggression kind of getting involved there. Now, if there is some motivation for the aggression, a lot of times it'll show up in the form of relational aggression or other actions that are designed to hurt others in more subtle ways. It's what we call kind of proactive aggressors. And you can also see this in individuals with externalizing disorders. Now, the next three are going to seem very common, but they are not unique to any one particular disorder. They're more lumped under this overall externalizing disorder. First is the issue of impulsivity. In this case, children are going to seem to be unable to control their behaviors according to the demands of a lot of different situations. This is usually most present in more structured settings where there's some certain expectations and children still have difficulty in being able to meet those. So a lot of times they're going to think before they act, or act before they think. Sorry, we should always have them think before they act. They may fail to wait their turn, blurt out answers in class when they're supposed to raise their hand, and interrupt others generally. A lot of this is a indication of a struggle with executive functioning, which executive functioning is really providing yourself internal direction on being able to control your behaviors. Kind of going along with impulsivity is hyperactivity. Hyperactivity is going to be much more evident. You're not going to wonder if somebody is hyperactive. They're going to hit you over the head with it. And that you're going to see a lot of squirming and fidgeting, just restless types of behavior, and trouble sitting still. So these are the kids popping out of the seats all the time. Or they may be touching the seat, but they are certainly not sitting, and they just have a hard time staying still. Now, some other things that you will see in this hyperactivity is that it's going to occur across situations, and it may even be where they don't need as much sleep because they just kind of have a higher running motor than most of the rest of us. And as I was saying before, this hyperactivity you're going to see a lot more in structured settings than unstructured ones, because unstructured, they're just going to kind of meld in with the regular population. It's when they are expected to do things like sit in their chair and listen to the teacher. That's when it's going to start showing up. And then the final of these kind of common symptoms that we see among externalizing disorder is attention deficits. And this is characterized a lot of times by the distractibility of individuals. They're going to maybe frequently shift from one task to another, yet never quite completing any of the tasks. They may not pay a lot of attention to detail, so they're making more careless mistakes, and they have a real difficult time staying organized. Sometimes they may even be appeared kind of spacey or out of it in this kind of inattention. So when we take all of these symptoms and put them all together, we begin to get more specific types of disorders. Before we get into that, I want to just show you some of the impulsivity, aggressiveness, and how that kind of peaks as we go on. And as you can see, for juveniles, we tend to have, I don't know what was happening in the 90s, but you do see an increase here in the arrest for juveniles. I think there was a lot of things going on that kind of relate to that. But you see there's a pretty consistent of at least 300 per 100,000 arrests for juveniles. And then you saw this little peak. And that just goes to the fact that I have another graph that I didn't include in here, but that I use for other class, where you see a real peak in kind of adolescent onset sort of disorders or adolescent limited kind of anger or aggression rule violations, because you see the arrests historically for a variety of issues is usually in the teens to early adulthood. And it just kind of points to the validity of that adolescent limited too. So as far as disorders, we're going to be running through a few of these. We've talked about some of these briefly, but these are applied specifically to children and adolescents. One of the more common childhood sort of disorders is ADHD. You can see that ADHD in its definition or name is going to have a lot of the factors that we just talked about combining. So you're going to see things like attention deficit issues, so the distractibility, frequent shift in activities, careless mistakes. Then you see the hyperactivity aspect, which is the squirming and restless behavior. You throw impulsivity kind of into that hyperactivity aspect of it. And you've got a lot of difficulties. And you can see as those children there, all of them displaying kind of ADHD kind of characteristics, especially the little boy messing around with his socks and stuff while everybody else in his class is working. Now, the thing with ADHD is that they don't mean to do it. It's not an intentional or oppositional. When I work in my private practice, parents will continually say when they have children that are having behavior issues, "Oh, but they're not mean. They don't mean to do it. They can't help themselves." And a lot of times that's very characteristic or descriptive of someone with ADHD. And the fact of ADHD is it usually has to occur before the age of 12. So you can't get ADHD in mid-adulthood typically, especially in this day and age. If you haven't been diagnosed with ADHD as a child, you're probably not going to have it as an adult. You can see here is a state-based prevalence data of ADHD diagnoses, and you can see especially in the southeast of the U.S., fairly high rates. And there in Kentucky, you can see the rates range from about 11 to 14% of the population. So it's pretty high. And in other words, you're going to see at least one or two children with ADHD in a typical classroom in the school systems. A different type of externalizing disorder is oppositional defiant disorder. This is more the people that are going to have that kind of anger and rule-breaking type of behavior. And as you can see, the pattern is angry, defiant, vindictive behavior, getting back at others. The rule violations are relatively minor. They're not going to be ones that the law would get involved with. It would be violating school or home rules. And there is a lot of comorbidity between ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, meaning that both of those are frequently occurring together. And if you are impulsive and get yourself into trouble and then you react against that, you can see where the two types of symptoms feed into each other pretty easily. Now, if you get more severe behavior starting to pop up, what you begin to see is the issue of conduct disorder. And this is going to be more persistent and repetitive patterns of serious rule violations. Most of these rule violations are going to be illegal and antisocial. And you can see some of the activities there in the photos. A lot of times it is a continuity from oppositional defiant into conduct disorder. It's usually a kind of a three-step process over the years. And so what you see is the development of oppositional defiance in more early to mid-childhood, that moving to conduct disorder maybe in adolescence. And then if that persists, you can see antisocial personality disorder oftentimes resulting. And so a lot of the symptoms or the rule violations of those that have conduct disorder are what we call index offenses. And these are crimes against people or property and that is illegal at any age. So it's not just like, oh, you're drinking beer and that's illegal. That's a status offense. No, this would be more like bodily harm. And it doesn't matter how old you are. that would be a violation, and it would be something that we would want to be concerned about. So that's going to wrap up our beginning or intro to Chapter 16 in childhood disorders, especially looking at some of the particulars of externalizing disorders. In our next module, we are going to start exploring the frequency and various causes of externalizing disorders.